We are very happy to have Ulrich Schmid here with us. He's a very good and old friend of this institution. He's a member in our academic board, and it's a pleasure for us to have him as a guest every spring when he helps us really in ways, in very important ways, to pick up, to select our new fellows. We always wanted to lure him to come here for a conference, but he's too busy. You should know that, you probably know that he's not only a very esteemed and loved professor in St. Gallen for Russian studies. He writes articles for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. He writes a lot. He had his last book presented also at the NEG last year. He does a lot of things in the Ukraine, for the Ukraine, but not only, for Poland, for Russia, for this culture in these areas, and for Romania too. And I wanted to tell you something, I don't know, something that maybe you don't know about him, and I tried to Google him, and I made a huge mistake, a huge one. Because I wrote very wrong his name, and it was Schmid with a T in the end, and the first choice was serial killer. But it was not our Ulrich Schmid, so first I was very, frightened. But actually Ulrich Schmid is also representing St. Gallen, and we have important cooperation with University in St. Gallen, and he's our Swiss friend. So we're very happy that you, Andri, and Katarina Bigger somehow convinced him to come to Bucharest. Actually, he was convinced to come to Bucharest for a conference, and not only for our academic board. And we are happy to see him again in April. But for now, thank you again.
So I'm Mark, and I have to thank you, Valentina, and the whole crew of the NEC for all the wonderful work you did, also for this winter academy. And I also have to apologize that I wasn't able to come earlier because our semester is already in full swing, and so I really had to make ends meet. What I want to present to you today is basically not about content. So I do not want to tell you about the Ukrainian literary history. Of course, there will be examples from the history of Ukrainian literature, but my talk is rather a conceptual one. And I take issue with the notion of post-colonialism as applied to the Ukrainian situation. Ever since the Australian Slavist Marko Pavlishin came up in his seminal paper with the topic post-colonial features in contemporary Ukrainian culture in 1992, the concept of the post-colonial condition has been vastly applied to the study of contemporary Ukrainian culture. Pavlishin constructed a Hegelian pyramid with the notions colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial. The colonial refers to the self-marginalization of Ukrainian culture as it is famously present both in the Tsarist and the Soviet period. The anti-colonial encompasses the revolt and the protest against the perceived colonial situation in Ukraine. And finally, the post-colonial addresses a constellation in which the presence of both the colonial and the anti-colonial is acknowledged and playfully transposed into an ambivalent text. Pavlishin's conception aptly describes the post-colonial condition of Ukrainian culture since the demise of the Soviet Union. One special feature is the post-colonial and postmodern use of sexual motives in contemporary Ukrainian literature. Erotic rhetoric demystifies both imperial and national values. However, the idea of Ukrainian post-colonialism remains centered around an understanding of coloniality, which stems from a paradigm with quite different features. The most important thinkers derive their concept of coloniality from the British Empire, and the most prominent case being colonial India. Apart from obvious parallels, there are significant differences between the post-colonial situation of India and Ukraine. The hegemonial culture was, in the British example, completely different from the marginalized colonial Indian traditions. On the contrary, Ukrainian culture developed in close proximity to, and sometimes even in dominance of, Russian culture. Finally, the relation between Russia and Ukraine today is not that between a former empire and the young nation. Russia faces the same post-colonial problems as Ukraine. Incidentally, it even blames the West to be the cultural hegemon. At this point, the notion of internal colonization comes into play. Alexander Etkin has pointed to the long history of this analytical concept of internal colonization, which was first used in 1843 by the German traveler August von Axthausen. Subsequently, famous Russian historians like Kluchevsky and Solovyov also relied on this notion of internal colonization. From the point of view of internal colonization, the Russian Empire does not acquire colonies abroad, but colonizes its own territory. It acts like an occupational power towards its own population. It spreads the institutions of the state. It extends the capital, the civilization from the capital to remote areas. For our context, this means that coloniality is not only a relation between several nationalizing cultures that happen to be under the same imperial rule, but an internal condition of the Russian Empire itself. Another conceptual problem is the relation between the postmodern and the post-colonial. For Pavlyushin, post-colonial writing in Ukraine is essentially postmodern. However, postmodernism is something which, on the one hand, is a playful game with several ideological positions, but on the other hand, postmodernism is not less serious about its own truth, that modernism is about its own claims. The post in postmodernism refers to a diversification of a monolithic truth, which eventually becomes a choice of options on an equal footing. What then does the post in post-colonialism mean? Kwame Anthony Appiah aptly addressed this problem in a seminal essay from 1991, and the title was, "Is the post in postmodernism the same as the post in post-colonial?" And post-colonialism, in Appiah's understanding, does not abolish or even fight the colonial condition which persists even after the global process of decolonialization in the 20th century. Political independence does not necessarily come with economic or cultural autonomy. Post-colonialism is rather a space-clearing gesture, as Appiah has it, which allows for new modes of cultural expression. However, there is a clear difference to postmodernism. Appiah describes the post-colonial situation as a post-optimistic one, and he literally says post-coloniality is a condition of pessimism. It is precisely this feature that may explain why post-colonialism has become such an attractive, interpretive pattern for both Ukrainian writers and critics. A telling example is Oksana Zabushko's recent novel, The Museum of Abandoned Secrets, where she attacks all former occupants of Ukraine, the Poles, the Germans, the Russians. The post-colonial narrative of self-victimization, of course, is a very popular one because it offers a clear-cut identity. At the same time, this narrative is very limiting. It disenfranchises the subject and reduces it to the role of a victim of historical events that maybe even occurred before the subject's own birth. The analytical concept of post-coloniality does not exhaustingly describe the Ukrainian situation. Perhaps we should not direct our gazes towards the relation between, say, the British Empire and colonized India, but towards the heterogeneity of the colonizing power itself. A case in point, for instance, is Great Britain itself. The official name is United Kingdom, which already points to the composite structure of this political and social agent. I propose to complement the post-colonial discourse about contemporary Ukraine with an analytical concept from Latin American studies. And here I would, this is the Museum of Abandoned Secrets from Oksana Zabushko. And this is the seminal paper by Mary-Louise Pratt, who is a scholar in Latin American studies, and she introduced the notion of cultural contact zones in 1991 to describe the encounter between indigenous people in Peru and the Spanish conquerors in early modern times. Neither states nor nations lie at the heart of Pratt's conception. Rather, she draws attention to phenomena like auto-ethnography, transculturation, collaboration, hybridity, bilingualism, mediation, parody, imaginary dialogue, and vernacular expression. And I think already the simple enumeration of these analytic concepts illustrates how fruitful her concept is, not only in a colonial or post-colonial context, but also in a heterogeneous cultural space as Ukraine in past and present. I will try to go through Pratt's categories and apply them to the Ukrainian cultural space. From the point of view of cultural contact zones, there is no such thing as a pure Ukrainian culture. This is why the notion Ukrainian should always be used in quotation marks. I will confine myself to one example for each category. Other cases in point might be added, but for the sake of clarity, one example should suffice. So, the first category of Marie-Louise Pratt, auto-ethnography. Auto-ethnography is a device that emerges only at a certain point of literary history. Writing has to emancipate itself from the traditional religious and political purposes of the medieval tradition. Social reality in terms of ethnic culture has to become an interesting topic in the historical or even romantic sense of the word. 19th century Ukrainian culture started off in the tonality of heteroethnography. Most Russian travelogues cast Ukraine as a kind of a domestic Arcadia, but of course always with the main interpretive key of provinciality. A clear departure from this model is the work of Grigory Kvitka-Osnovyanenko. Only a fifth of his writings are in Ukrainian. However, the Ukrainian topic dominates most of his Russian prose. Notably, he introduced the figure of the Ukrainophone trickster Shelmenko in 3 of his Russian language plays. And the implied author here wavers between ethnography, posing at a Russian voice, and auto-ethnography, posing as a Ukrainian voice. And in terms of auto-ethnography, there is a clear evolution in Kvitka's oeuvres. First, he embraced and adopted imposed stereotypes and even used Russian for the literary self-description of provincial Ukraine. The title of one of his early comedies clearly epitomizes this mode. The title is The Guest from the Capital, or Turmoil in the Provincial Town. This is a play from 1827. And in another text, in Soldatsky Patriot from 1833, which is a Ukrainian text, he gave an account from the periphery in Ukraine. And Kvitka was sophisticated enough to reflect upon the reception of his text in the Russian context. And in a fictional letter to the editor, he even parodies the language of the dominant culture by using a phonetic Ukrainian orthography. And the sentence is here, so you see the first part of the sentence is in Ukrainian, and the second part of the sentence is in Russian, but in Ukrainian orthography. Это нечто по-чухонски, зачем печатать, когда никто не разумеет. Although the last word, of course, is also a Ukrainianism. Kvitka proposes in his late Ukrainian short stories a counter-narrative, which claims to give a more truthful account of the Ukrainian space. Kvitka made an important choice when he moved from the adaptation of Russian cliches about Ukraine to an autonomous account of the context. In his later works, Kvitka did not even try to assume a position in the very contested field of Russian literature. Ultimately, he published his pieces in provincial Kharkiv and addressed an audience that was local and proficient in Ukrainian. The second category, which was mentioned by Marie-Louise Pratt, is transculturation. Transculturation is a concept that was introduced to cultural studies by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz. Ortiz uses the notion of transculturation to describe the various processes that characterize the history of Cuba. The encounter between the native people and the Spanish conquerors, the arrivals of the slaves from Africa, the mixture of European and Asian businessmen, and eventually Ortiz proposes to subsume all ongoing processes of what he calls disculturation, exculturation, acculturation, and inculturation under the umbrella of transculturation. And the result of these processes of transculturation in the case of Cuba would be, according to Ortiz, Cubanidad, or Cubanity. For the first time, Ortiz applied his concept of transculturation in his famous book, Cuban Counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar, from 1940, and he explained the result of every union of cultures to be similar to that of the reproductive process between individuals. The offspring always has something of both parents, but it's always different from each of them. And in this book, Ortiz shows how the two main natural products of Cuba, tobacco and sugar, generate specific social, economic, and cultural practices. The notion of transculturation as a dynamic, complex, and sometimes even contradictory process of cultural exchange may well be applied to the Russian-Ukrainian contact zone in the 19th century. And I choose here the figure of Marko Wowczok. This is the pseudonym of Maria Wilinska. Wowczok was not only a traveler between cultures, but also between genders. She was born as the daughter of a Russian aristocrat, and she assumed the persona of a Ukrainian Cossack, the legendary Marko Wowczok, for her literary production. She was exposed to Ukrainian by her first husband, and she became famous in 1857 with Ukrainian folk tales. Marko Wowczok afterwards changed to Russian. She produced a Russian version of her Ukrainian folk tales, and even the famous Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev noticed her, but he said he produced an own, or he worked on her translation, because in the preface to an edition that was commissioned by Turgenev, he said that Marko Wowczok's Russian texts bear all too clear imprint of the Little Russian diction, and Turgenev wanted to produce a more pure Russian version of Wowczok's tales. An important figure in Marko Wowczok's literary career was Panteleimon Kulish, who was one of the main organizers of Ukrainian literature, because Kulish organized a literary journal. He basically created the office of the national poet Shevchenko, and he even translated the Bible into Ukrainian, which is a prerequisite, of course, for a full-fledged national culture. So for Kulish, Marko Wowczok was an essential addition to the hitherto, as he saw it, imperfect system of Ukrainian literature. Just as Kulish modeled Shevchenko in a kind of a Ukrainian national poet, he also modeled Wowczok in a kind of a Ukrainian Georges Sand. And in a perhaps unconscious adaptation of Georges Sand's literary biography, Kulish himself fell in love with Marko Wowczok, and was even ready to abandon his own wife for his new protege. Wowczok herself wavered for a certain time between the two languages, Ukrainian and Russian. After the ban on Ukrainian literary texts in 1863, Wowczok switched definitely to Russian. And in her final years, Marko Wowczok seemed to return to Ukrainian literature. She worked on a historical novel with the title Haidamaki, and the Russian draft of this novel and the final chapter in Ukrainian are preserved in her archive. And it's quite notable that she picked up the topic of Haidamaki, which is a central poem by the national poet Shevchenko, and by doing so, she in a way also wanted to make the system of Ukrainian literature complete. Collaboration. Collaboration in the Latin American context was a more complex phenomenon than just the despicable surrender of local elites and their subsequent administrative backing of a foreign occupying force. Collaboration may also refer to practices of cultural appropriation and learning. Sociologists have described the adaptation of other cultural models in terms of upward assimilation. From such a perspective, cultural contact becomes the framework for innovative practices of self-empowerment. The most famous representative of such a practice in the Ukrainian-Russian context is Theophan Prokopovich. The beginning of his career was deeply rooted in the Western, more precisely the Latin context. He received a Roman Catholic education, but maybe he had a falling out with the papal institutions, and later on he fiercely opposed Roman Catholicism. Back in Ukraine, he accepted the church union and taught first at the Mohyla Academy in Kiev. And he invoked Mazepa as a national hero in the preface to his drama Vladimir from 1705. However, after the treason of Mazepa and the Russian victory at Poltava in 1709, Prokopovich became a staunch propagandist of Russian imperialism in general and Peter the Great's rule in particular. Ultimately, Prokopovich was the first high official to fuse Orthodox Christianity and autocracy into one ideology of Tsarist power in Russia. However, I think it would be wrong to see in Prokopovich merely an opportunistic careerist. When he moved on Peter's orders to the Russian capital, Petersburg, in 1716, Prokopovich was very ambivalent about this new position. Moreover, his theological works and sermons were also in his imperial period informed by Jesuit and even Protestant traditions. Prokopovich thus is a collaborator in quotation marks, who does not betray his formal intellectual positions but molds them into a political ideology that purports to be Russian Orthodox but still displays traces of the compact zone. The next notion is hybridity. In Latin American studies, it was the Argentinian anthropologist Nestor Garcia Canclini who applied the biological term hybridity to social and political phenomena. In his book, Hybrid Cultures, Strategies for Entering and Leaving Modernity from 1990, Garcia Canclini looks at the difficult position of Latin American cultures between tradition and modernity, between popular and high culture. And Canclini also analyzes the symbolic behavior of famous writers like Jorge Luis Borges and Octavio Paz. Both became famous because of their close ties with the Western cultural establishment. And a similar hybrid model of success is represented in the case of Nikolai Gogol, or Mykola Gogol, as the Ukrainians would have it. Gogol made an impressive career and is considered until today to be one of the most acclaimed writers of Russian literature. Just to place him at the core of the Russian canon, however, does not grasp the complexity of the situation. Apart from one short letter, Gogol did not write anything in Ukraine. However, his fame is based on a literary innovation that could be described as a conscious exploitation of the Russian reader's horizon of expectation about things Ukrainian. How astutely Gogol explored and eventually served the taste preferences of the Russian readership may be seen in his literary debut. In 1829, he wrote a long poem with the title Hans Küchelkarte. This epigonic text was a complete failure and after having read the devastating criticism, Gogol hastened to buy all the remaining copies from all the bookstores in St. Petersburg. And this catastrophe had an enlightening effect on Gogol. He looked for a new mode of writing and found it in the decanonizing style of the Ukrainian cultural space. And already in 1831, Gogol had published two pieces in prose that signaled their Ukrainian topics in the title. So the first piece was from the Little Russian novel Strashny Kaban and Hetman. These two texts are still a mixture between established literary models and stylistic innovation. Gogol borrows narrative devices from the love story à la Jean-Jacques Rousseau or from the historical novel à la Walter Scott, but at the same time Gogol stylizes his protagonist's speech with Ukrainian elements, with the vernacular expression. Gogol's trick here is not to use real Ukrainian but Russian with a Ukrainian syntax and Ukrainian lexical splinters. Gogol brought this model to perfection in his collection of Ukrainian tales, Večera na Hutoré Blízky. Here you see the first edition, and Mirvolod. Večera na Hutoré Blízky is from 1832, and it's quite interesting that Gogol at the beginning of the chapters used motti from Ukrainian authors, and at the end of the book he inserted a glossary of Ukrainian words to highlight the otherness of his writing. Gogol readily filled the Russian expectation about the domestic Arcadia with romantic clichés and stereotypes, and on the Russian side, Pushkin, the Russian national poet, complemented and corroborated this view by famously praising the Ukrainians after having read Gogol as a dancing and singing people. Marie-Louise Pretz's next concept is bilingualism. And I would say in the Eastern European contact zones, the very concept of national culture rather belongs to the sphere of research objects than to the researcher's analytical toolbox. Even in the perspective of imperial subjects, national culture was rather a goal than a given. Ultimately, the quest for, or perhaps the construction of a national culture followed Western European models with institutions like the national poet, national literary journals, and Bible translations. And just as Mickiewicz, the Polish national poet, hails Lithuania as his own in the opening lines of the Polish national epic, the Ukrainian national poet Shevchenko wrote his prose in Russian and his poetry, or the bulk of his poetry, in Ukrainian. George Grabovich spoke about Shevchenko's duality. He distinguished an adjusted from a non-adjusted self in the figure of the Ukrainian national poet. The adjusted self, according to Grabovich, articulates itself in Russian prose, in the diary, and in the letters. Shevchenko acts as a rational subject of the Russian Empire and adopts well-established discourses of social progress and romantic aesthetics. The non-adjust self, on the other hand, is driven by an irrational force which compels the poet to produce lyrical texts that claim to represent an absolute truth. The poet fights with his Ukrainian voice the demonic evil which is represented by the Tsarist system in the perception of Shevchenko. Both aspects, the adjusted and the non-adjusted self, belong to Shevchenko's literary existence. They do not complement each other, they rather form a sharp contradiction. In a sense, the contact zone is a battlefield of values, languages, and modes of expression in the poet's own subjectivity. To complicate things even more, it is sometimes impossible to separate Shevchenko's two selves. In his letters, he occasionally switches from Ukrainian to Russian and back. In most cases, these linguistic shifts seem to be unmotivated. Sometimes, however, an official tone can be reached by the poet by using Russian, or, to be more precise, by using a variety of Ukrainian that is very close to Russian. Mary-Louise Pratt's next concept would be mediation. Contact zones are spaces in which cultural agents may move according to their needs, negotiate their attitudes, and mediate between different positions. Sometimes institutional constraints apply. However, there is a simple political law of repression. As a rule, the oppressed culture assumes only for a short time a weaker position. Repression ultimately endows the marginalized culture with a new self-consciousness and a sense of agency. The modern Ukrainian nationalism that emerged towards the end of the 19th century was only made possible by restrictions imposed upon the use of Ukrainian language in 1863 and 1876. Not even the revocation of these bans in 1905 could revert the process of Ukrainian nationalization, which culminated in separatism and eventually in the proclamation of an independent Ukrainian state. Before these dramatic events, mediations between different positions in the contact zones was a widely spread pattern. Mikola, this would be the Ukrainian version of the first name, or Nikolai Kostomarov, is a fine example of an intellectual who was educated in Russia and who became a Ukrainian writer and historian on Ukraine by choice. He was born to a wealthy Russian landowner and his Ukrainian bondmate. And during his university studies, Kostomarov taught himself Ukrainian, and he asked friends and his servant about the meaning of unknown words. Kostomarov tried to come up with a new tone when he wrote about Ukrainian Cossack past, and he tried to endow the Ukrainian history with the aesthetic and epic dignity of its own. In the 1840s, Kostomarov was politically engaged in a utopian vision of a pan-Slavic federation that was supposed to stand up against German rationalism, French atheism, and English mercantilism. And this idea was to become one of the leitmotifs in his oeuvre. He turned more than once to his fellow Slavs to explain why Ukraine, Russia, and Poland are not enemies, but brothers. And it's interesting that Kostomarov even wanted to implement his all-Slavic conception in his personal life. He considered himself to be a cultural representative of the united Great and Little Russia, having a great Russian father and a Ukrainian mother, and he planned to marry a Polish girl. And their children would embody Slavic unity between Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. The whole story took eventually a tragic turn. However, Kostomarov, he was arrested 2 days before his scheduled wedding and put in jail. And several decades later, he still married his Polish girl, 1847. So, this would be a nice example for mediation. Now, parody. In cultural contact zones, discourses fuse, meet, or clash. Moreover, these discourses notice or influence each other and sometimes even use mimicry in order to imitate or subvert a dominant position. Parody is probably one of the most powerful devices when it comes to attack or debunk the cultural hegemony. Such a development can be observed already quite early in the 19th century. Petro Kulak-Artemovsky artfully plays with the cultural incompetence of the average Russian reader in the capital about things Ukrainian. Actually, Kulak-Artemovsky inverts the asymmetry of information. In his text, an incompetent Ukrainophone narrator has so little knowledge about the Russian Empire that he even does not get the name of the capital right. He talks about Piantenburg or Piantenburg and thus discloses his encyclopedic ignorance about the hegemonial culture. Of course, Kulak-Artemovsky does not criticize the low level of education in the Ukrainian province, but ironically mirrors the self-centeredness of Russian culture in the capital. And maybe some of you still remember this famous film by Sacha Baron Cohen about Borat. Basically, it's the same device as Sacha Baron Cohen used in Borat. Borat is not an incompetent Kazakh journalist, but he is the embodiment of all the Western prejudices about Kazakhstan. Even a plaidoyer for a Ukrainian literary language comes in the guise of a highly ironic text. In 1819, Kulak wrote the short prose piece Deszczo pro toho Haraska, something about that Harasko. And Harasko, of course, ironically refers to the Roman poet Horace. And the Ukrainian distortion is programmatic. Kulak's unreliable narrator explains that Horace wrote in Lithuanian, po-Litvinsky, and further on, the text plays on homonyms that bear different meanings in Russian and Ukrainian. And finally, the text closes with a challenge to the dominance of the Russian language in the Ukrainian lands. And the narrator explains, I quote, "We all know that every Christian people uses its own language. The Turks speak Turkish, the Germans speak German." Well, the first Christian people that seems to corroborate Kulak's case are the Turks. However, this is more than just a comical error. Kulak uses this ignorant point to demonstrate that it is possible to make a correct point, namely the acceptance of the Ukrainian language in the imperial context, in a situation of complete cultural ignorance. In Kulak's case, by the assumption that the Turks are Christians or that the Ukrainians are little Russians for that matter. Imaginary dialogue, the next concept from Latin American studies. In cultural context zones, every utterance, in a way, incorporates the other. Writers cannot define their own position without taking into account the other views. Without taking into account how the other views them from outside. This is a classical case of a construction of an image. How does the other perceive me? What is my image? How and what do I have to do to influence this perception, my image? To complicate the situation even further, thank you very much. To complicate the situation even further, also kind of a meta-image may be constructed. How does the other's perception of me look in my own perception? How do I perceive the other perceptions of myself? Interesting literary embodiment of this imaginary dialogue is the poetic dialogue of Great Russia and Little Russia, written in 1762 by Semyon Divovich, a scribe in a Cossack chancery in Luchy. The long poem consists of over 2,000 lines, most of which belong to Little Russia. Great Russia basically asks insulting and provocative questions such as, who are you? Do you have a history? What is your aristocratic lineage? Why do you want to act on your own? Little Russia answers with pride and high self-assurance. Ukraine is in a toponym, however, that is mentioned only once, but Little Russia as an interlocutor proudly retells the heroic Cossack past. Since the whole text is written from a Ukrainian perspective, it should not be read as a genuine dialogue. Within the fictional framework of the text, the Russian arrogance and condescension, of course, may be interpreted as a Ukrainian projection. Great Russia, which explicitly claims to be the only Russia, and Little Russia presents its own legitimation. The imaginary dialogue between the two interlocutors can be reduced to Little Russia's self-presentation. Little Russia wants to achieve a certain image in Great Russia, which in turn represents Ukraine's Russian meta-image. It would certainly be possible to analyze this dialogue also with Bakhtin's categories of the simple directed word, the double directed word, and the multi-directed word from Bakhtin's famous book on Dostoevsky. It is noteworthy that Little Russia strives to be on an equal footing with Great Russian culture in this text. A case in point is the description of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's heroic death, which also follows the literary model of Ovid's seventh elegy from Christia. And such stylization elevates the dignity of Little Russia. At the same time, it is clear that Little Russia here assumes a position that Michel Foucault famously defined as paresia. And I shortly quote to you the definition of paresia as put forward by Michel Foucault. In paresia, the speaker uses his freedom and chooses frankness instead of persuasion, truth instead of falsehood or silence, the risk of death instead of life and security, criticism instead of flattery, and moral duty instead of self-interest and moral apathy. And by implication, paresia is only possible from a weaker position. However, paresia often lays bare a tacit, if unconscious, asymmetry of power positions. And in Divovich's dialogue, the effect of Little Russia's paresia is overwhelming. Great Russia, in the end, acknowledges Little Russia's truth and vows to live from now on in friendship on equal terms in a political union. And of course, one could call this expectation the utopian punchline of the imaginary dialect as presented here in the 18th century. The final concept from Latin American studies that can be applied to Ukrainian studies is vernacular expression. Vernacular expression means that the literary, oft highly formalized style of the dominant culture is challenged by a subsystem that originates in the use of the popular language, the vernacular. And I would say the best example and best case in point is Ivan Kotlяревский with his Eneida. Eneida is a mock poem about the Ukrainian Cossacks, and it has been argued that certainly the Baroque texts from the 17th and the bulk of the 18th century, they are part of a Ukrainian literature. But Ukrainian national literature basically begins with Eneida. Kotlяревский took Virgil's epic and filled it with the coarse description of Cossack drinking, eating, and partying. However, the true hero of Kotlяревsky's epic is not the Ukrainian Cossack Aeneas, but the Ukrainian language. At length, Kotlяревsky uses in his works synonyms, elaborate expressions, and epigrammatical plays. And the goal of this rhetoric firework is to demonstrate the linguistic and artistic capacities of the vernacular of the Ukrainian language. And interestingly, the first edition of Kotlяревsky's Eneida appeared with the Russian language title Malorossiyskaya Eneida в трех частях in 1798 in St. Petersburg, in the Russian capital, accompanied by a Ukrainian-Russian dictionary. As many other Ukrainian cultural endeavors, also the debut of what has been called Ukrainian national literature takes place in the Russian capital in St. Petersburg. And other significant events for Ukrainian culture in St. Petersburg would, for instance, be the artistic socialization of the young painter Taras Shevchenko, the professorship of Nikolai Kostomarov, and the publication of the Ukrainian journal Osnova in 1861 and 1862. However, the reaction of the Russian audience remained low-key. Among fellow Ukrainian writers, Kotlяревsky had an immense success and even became a role model for a specific Ukrainian writing. However, Eneida was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it established a recognizable identity for a culture that so far was considered to be provincial at best. On the other hand, the so-called Kotlяревщина was so dominant that it took 40 years before Shevchenko was to introduce an entirely new tragic tone into Ukrainian literature. Notably, Shevchenko's praise for Kotlяревsky was highly ambivalent. Shevchenko wrote about Kotlяревsky in 1847, Eneida is good, but nevertheless a joke in a Muscovite manner. And this quote shows quite clearly that the comic style of Kotlяревщина had its cultural expiration date. In a way, the further literary development shows that Gogol, who first had tried to write romantic poems in a Pushkinian manner, soon took up the Kotlяревщина and introduced this particular style into the Russian literary system. And this move yielded great success and made Gogol an acclaimed writer. However, eventually Gogol abandoned Kotlяревщина altogether and elaborated a highly idiosyncratic style, for instance by authoring the novel Dead Souls. On the other hand, Shevchenko did not accept the parodistic tone of Kotlяревщина but eventually embraced the vernacular as his very own mode of literary expression. The rhetoric needs for his very successful Ukrainian poems, however, were borrowed from Russian Romanticism, especially from the Russian national poet Pushkin. And I think one can show this in a scheme. So here we have the Ukrainian and Russian literary systems, and here you see how these modes of writing change. Kotlяревsky's Ukrainian Eneida had a Russian Ukrainian dictionary. The same Russian Ukrainian dictionary appeared in Gogol's Ukrainian tales that were written in Russian. On the other hand, we have the Russian romantic poems by Pushkin that influenced Russian language poems by Shevchenko, and finally the anti-imperial Ukrainian language poems can be seen as a kind of a literary adaptation from a genre that basically came from the Russian system. And here you can see how this contact zone even should not be conceived of in geographical terms, because much of this basically happened in Petersburg, in the very center of the empire. I come to the conclusion. Ukraine's cultural situation has been characterized as postcolonial, either in a Hegelian or in a temporal sense. There is certainly much truth to this. However, there is a clear and present danger, if I may so, and this danger consists in the fact that Ukrainian culture may be trapped in the cage of self-victimization. Moreover, if we apply the concept of post-colonialism to Ukraine, we should always keep in mind the process of internal colonization that affected not only the non-Russian nationalities, but newly colonized territories with a sizable number of Russian colonists as well. To be sure, this development was not only characteristic of the Tsarist, but also of the Soviet Empire. What do we gain if we turn to the concept of contact zones from Latin American studies? I would mention 4 points. First, we abandon the dichotomy of cultural hegemon and subaltern colony and start to think in spaces where symbolic practices generate complex structures that need to be analyzed from various points of view. Second, we focus on cultural production rather than on cultural repression. In the Ukrainian-Russian case, self-fashioning and othering are often intertwined. And this constellation initiated processes that draw not only on the neighboring culture, but also on European models, be it directly or indirectly. The third point would be one feature of the Latin American situation is the dwindling power of the cultural hegemon. Almost all Southern American countries had gained independence by 1825, as early as 1825. In a similar vein, also the imperial project of Russia in the 19th century may be characterized as a process of decay. And recently, Ilya Gerasimov, Maria Mogilner, and Sergei Lyubov suggested an innovative approach to describe this situation. They came up with the concept of a new imperial history of northern Eurasia. And you already sense that they avoid the name of Russia, the new imperial history of northern Eurasia, and they talked about the balancing of the imperial situation, which had to come to terms in the 19th century with several national projects, such as the Ukrainian, or if you will, such as the Russian national project for that matter. And my fourth and final point would be the Latin American situation always had to deal with immense social heterogeneity. The cultural contact zone was determined not only by colonial but also by domestic social repression. And such aspects need to be taken into account also in the Ukrainian situation. And the most prominent example here is maybe the life trajectory of the national poet Shevchenko, who moved between provincial and imperial spaces, between social estates, and between modes of expression. Thank you very much.
And if I might, thank you, Ulrich. I think this was a brilliant presentation, and I do agree with you. This kind of post-colonial paradigm isn't really effective for kind of to explain all the complexity of cultural and social and economic and political development in Ukraine. And I think that this model of contact zone is definitely much more informative. But while listening to your presentation, I was thinking that obviously these 8, I think, models or types, they cannot exhaust, right, all the examples or types or whatever kind of all the Ukrainian writers. I was thinking whether you could maybe suggest any additional, say, types or models for Ukrainian writers. And I was obviously thinking about like Panas Mirny or Nechulovitsky, or maybe modernists like, the later 19th century, or Leslie Ukrainka or Mikhail Kuzbrinsky. Where would you place them? Or it's kind of maybe outside of the contact zone, or maybe a different contact zone, that maybe just if you could, elaborate on those who don't necessarily fit within this society.
Yes, I think this is a very important question, and it draws on the problem basically which you could word in a following manner. How is Ukrainian realism in the second half of the 19th century different from Russian realism in the second half of the 19th century? Because of course all those writers like Nechulovitsky and Mirny, they were aware of what was going on in Russia. And I think you also have to keep in mind that basically the Russian realistic novel from the second half of the 19th century basically turned Russian literature into a part of world literature. Before 1860, I would say, Russian literature had existed only in the imperial space, and only when the novels came, and here of course the most important author was not Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, but Turgenev, who had very close ties to the Western literary systems. And here I would say the interesting thing is that probably those 9 concepts are already a lot, I would say. And in a way, I think you could subsume the problem of the Ukrainian realistic novel in the second half of the 19th century under this notion of transculturation. In a way, I think, and this is something which also could be reproached to Mary-Louise Pratt, those 9 concepts, they are not all on the same level, hierarchical level. I think transculturation is a much broader concept than, let's say, a concept like parody, which only highlights a very small point in the literary culture. So I think what I would say is interesting is that one should give up this asymmetrical notion of relations between cultures that in a way implicitly is always present in this post-colonial theoretical discourse. And I think in the Latin American context, you have much more this postmodernist stance, which, goes more into amalgamation. The problem, and of course here are also the limits of this concept, is that at the end of this process of cultural zones, paradoxically stands the evolution of what at least Ukrainian writers wanted to be a Ukrainian national literature and not a contact zone literature.
Indeed, there are quite many concepts already. I was thinking among these 9 concepts or categories, which one was the most problematic to bring the case, to give an example? Perhaps there were some concepts where you had 20 examples, and one seemed to be, somehow lacking the evidence, the proof. And the second one is about the first conclusion of yours, what we could gain from this theory, that somehow perhaps it will provoke to, to abandon this asymmetry of hegemon colony. To which extent do you believe it's realistic somehow to go beyond this self-victimization and dichotomy of colony and hegemon, not only in the literature perhaps studied, in the cultural studies, but also in other contexts, when we refer to the case of Ukraine?
Yes. Let me first answer your first question. The probably most difficult concept is the concept of collaboration, because it also has this ethical overtones, and this is also why I, for instance, focused on the late 18th and early 19th century. Because collaboration always has also quite awkward implications. If you go to the 20th century and look at people like Relevance, who basically tried to reconcile at a certain point the Bolshevist project with the Ukrainian national project, or people like Vinnichenko for that matter, who also in early 1920 traveled to Moscow and inquired about the possibility of a backing for a Ukrainian national communist system in Ukraine. So these are all people who have this little bit, on the one hand, that they are all caught in illusions. They all have these leftist things, and I think, again, Vinnichenko is an interesting case, who thought that the more leftist a political ideology is, the more it will be automatically concerned with the Ukrainian national cause. And so this was why he was not very fond of the Bolsheviks. But from all the non-Ukrainian governments, the Bolsheviks were the most sympathetic in his eyes, because it was the most leftist political movement. But on the other hand, I think all those, or most of these collaborative cases ended in tragedy. They were either shot or expelled into emigration. And I think here, of course, you very often, in the Ukrainian case, also run into delicate ethical problems which need to be taken into account. Could you still remind me shortly the second question?
To which extent it's possible to avoid this asymmetry, dichotomy of hegemon and colony, and whether we really can go beyond this self-victimization tendency?
I would say here we have a general problem which I think is present in all of the cultural studies that deal with more or less present time phenomena. I would say in the 18th and 19th century there was a more or less clear distinction between scientific description of reality and literary production. And in the 20th century, of course, beginning with avant-garde, literary theory and cultural production were very closely intertwined. And now the problem with the asymmetry of cultural hegemony and the subaltern in the post-colonial view lies in the fact that this is a problem that already is present in the mindset of people who produce cultural products. And in a way you have this problem of feedback between the theoretical discourse that feeds back into cultural production. And so basically, and this would be a Hegelian point, if people already think in terms of their cultural being post-colonial, they are post-colonial. And this is basically also a theoretical dilemma that was also explained by Bourdieu, who always pointed to the danger. What is the biggest danger of sociological work? That we find the sociologically petrified results, products of our own mental work that we projected onto reality, and now it's there because people embraced it and became what sociologists told them to be. And in a similar way, you could say that is the problem of post-colonialism today. And this is also why today you cannot just do away with the concept of post-colonialism. It was introduced, it has taken roots in contemporary Ukrainian culture, and it is there, and you have to take it into account.
So the first question is sort of similar to this kind of categorization. Obviously we don't have ideal types, so we cannot have ideal types. Were there any writers or those names that could fit in more than one category? So this is something kind of similar to another. And the second question is, I don't know if you're familiar with this recent book by, I believe it's Michael Fowler. She wrote a book about theater bomb in Ukraine. And basically I think your argument follows Victor's argument that imperial map was, like artistic map was rather decentralized, and it was the Bolsheviks who in the 1930s made it kind of centralized with Moscow obviously on top. And so basically the question is whether you believe in this, or whether you would support the argument of this decentralized artistic map, imperial map, and if so, how it fits with this with this new methodology, for instance.
I would say your first question leads us back to the Middle Ages. There is this nice expression of William Ockham. William Ockham's razor blade. And William Ockham was a medieval monk who said, "Ensja non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem." So, do not multiply your categories if you do not have to. So, use only categories that are so big that they, are able to grasp a certain phenomenon. Don't make it too narrow, don't make it too wide. And the razor blade was basically cut off all those categories that you don't need, that are either too narrow or too wide. And of course, arguably you could say 9, as I said, is a large number. Probably it would be possible also to reduce these categories. I applied all of them to phenomena in Ukraine because my aim was to show how these analytical categories from Latin American studies can be useful to explain at least the early stage of Ukrainian culture. I would say probably the 20th century, or as you mentioned, even the second half of the 19th century. Most of my examples basically came from late 18th century and early 19th century, which is a historically crucial time period for Ukrainian culture. So everything that comes afterwards probably is less comparable to the situation in Latin America. But as I said, I think also the internal weak condition of the Western European culture in the Latin American case after 1825, after political independence, and the dwindling power of the Russian Empire in the second half of the 19th century, that can be compared. And of course, you can attribute one or the other author to several categories. What you also can do is basically take out one aspect of one writer's oeuvre and attribute it, say it to the category of transculturation, and the other to bilingualism. For the sake of clarity, I just chose one author per category. Now the theater infrastructure, I just know Teer's work. I don't know this new book. What was her name?
It's called Beaumont on the Empire's Edge, and it just it appeared in 2017 last year in the Toronto Academic Press by Michael Fowler. But basically, she spoke about theatre, but obviously this kind of decentralized artistic map can be applicable to whatever, right? So she used it for her own case, but.
I think what comes here into play is the role of cultural institutions. Who sponsors cultural institutions? Are they sponsored centrally or decentrally? Are they used to spread an imperial notion of culture, or do they become also points of experiment? And I think in the Ukrainian case probably both is true. So you have imperial theaters, but you also have places like Kharkiv, which really become places of experimentation with non-imperial models of theater and drama.
So first of all, the first question is, why exactly should we stop thinking? I say we because I'm originally from Ukraine. So why should we exactly stop thinking about Ukraine in post-colonial terms, about Ukrainian literature in post-colonial terms? So why would that be productive? Because I feel that, for instance, let's say in the Ukrainian academia, we haven't even gotten fully to the point of thinking about Ukrainian post-colonial terms. So that matrix even hasn't been fully applied and reflected yet. So I don't know whether it would be productive to kind of jump across and start thinking differently. And then, second question, which is related, is if we apply the concept of the contact zones, what does it change in practical terms? Because does it make these interactions happening on equal terms? No, these contacts, there's still a symmetry. Even if there's those contacts happening. So how does that change things practically? I mean, okay, we will call it something else, but essentially there's still a symmetry, there's still a dominant position, power position, and a subjugated position. So I'm just curious, what does it yield in practical terms, not just in terms of changing the optics?
Yeah, let me disagree with your diagnosis that the concept of post-colonialism hasn't fully arrived in Ukrainian scholarship. I see it, at least in literary scholarship, very present. I also see it in cultural studies. And well, as I said, I think it's surfaced, and I think this is not a coincidence. It surfaced in 1992, immediately after Ukrainian independence, and of course it was in a way understandable that Ukraine and Ukrainian cultural history began to conceive of itself in terms of a colony that finally liberated itself. But as I said, I think there are clear differences between the colonial cases with the Western imperial powers like Great Britain or France or Portugal, for that matter. It is also quite indicative. There is a new Cambridge history of colonial literatures. There is no chapter on post-Soviet or imperial Russian literatures. They even look at post-colonial writing of immigrants in the French or the British culture. So I would say I don't think that the post-colonial theory hasn't arrived in Ukraine. I would even rather say it's a concept that already is a little bit worn off, at least in my perception. And I think it's also quite interesting that the first one, or one of the first one to introduce this notion of post-colonialism to things Ukrainian was an Australian scholar, Marko Pavlichin, and he basically said it is in the literary texts itself, this post-colonial consciousness, and this is why we may apply the analytical concept of post-coloniality to these texts from the late 80s or early 90s. Now the second question about asymmetry. Of course, asymmetry is always there. The interesting thing is that I come from Switzerland, and no one would say that the Swiss are in a post-colonial situation. Although, of course, there is a huge asymmetry. If you are a Swiss artist, you always have to look at the German market. If you are a Swiss-German writer, you cannot exist without Germany. The German rules of and taste preferences, they are always dominant. And it goes even so far as, for instance, the first history of Swiss-German literature was produced by a team of scholars from the GDR. And of course you can imagine why. The point behind that was that if there is a separate, if you will, post-colonial or anti-imperial Swiss-German literature, then by implication there is also the possibility of a separate GDR German literature. This was why the GDR team first wrote a Swiss history of literature. Now, I would say what we gain is, as I tried to explain in my last 4 points, that we do not fall into this trap of self-victimization once the situation of asymmetry is given. And if I follow the contemporary Russian-Ukrainian correctly, I also think that people try to emancipate themselves from this overwhelming position of the Russian culture. And I talked to Sergei Zhadan, and I asked him if his newest novel about Kharkiv was translated into Russian, and he said no. There was a plan and there was even a contract, but after 2014 the Russian editor resigned from the plan, and he himself didn't want any more. And I think this is an attitude that cannot be described anymore in post-colonial terms. I think there is a new self-consciousness, and this is why I think the more open concept of contact zone probably rids us of these dangers of self-victimization. And Mary-Louise Pratt herself says that contact zones are very much asymmetrical. There is never symmetry given.
I just use it when Pavlichin was writing about his post-colonialism. his vision was as post-colonialism was even something desired in a sense, because he was speaking about how we are anti-colonial, how much we define ourselves in this opposition to Russia. And of course, writing, you know, in the early 90s, it was very easy to see why he wanted to go beyond South entirely, to be in a different situation when we don't have to define ourselves. You know, Ukrainians don't have to define themselves against their big neighbor, the colony against the colonizer. But I do feel like this has been re-problematized recently, because the former colonizer is basically recolonizing Ukrainian territories. And I don't know.
I wouldn't conceptualize the Russian aggression or the Russian-backed aggression in the Donbass as an attempt to colonize. It's rather the expression of the complete failure to colonize Ukraine, because I think what Russia wanted with Ukraine was what happened with Armenia right now. They wanted to force them into the Eurasian Economic Union. And what happened now in Ukraine probably is only the second best solution, or not even a solution in quotation mark that the Kremlin wanted. Of course, the consequences are devastating for Ukraine, but on the other hand, I think it had also the effect on Ukraine that Ukraine finally drew a red line against Russian culture. In terms of Ukrainian cultural policy, also, sometimes a ridiculously red line. So, for instance, when Russian books are banned or Russian films are banned in Ukraine, I think this is not something that is doable or does even have sense or make sense in the 21st century. But I think after 2014, the Russian aggression, which I would not describe as a colonializing aggression, but it was a sheer military aggression, had a boosting effect on the development of a national Ukrainian culture and literature. I don't know if you agree with that.
I mean, I would say that still I see these dynamics, and I think when you speak about this drawing a red line, for me that actually further emphasizes the fact that we have to be aware of these intentions, of this potential aggression, ongoing aggression, and so that exactly this is why we sort of get caught again in this dynamics, which, let's say, publishing thought was a thing of the past, and arguably justly so.
Yes, that's right, but I think the concept of post-coloniality, or coloniality for that matter, is not possible if there is an open war between the two agents. I think in a way it would rather be possible to apply the concept of post-colonialism, let's say, to the relation between Finland and Russia in the 20th century. And I would say today, the Ukrainian-Russian relation probably is not comparable to the Finnish-Soviet-Russian relation in the second half of the 19th century, or in the whole 19th century, where there was always this, what Mary-Louise Pratt calls also this internal dialogue, where all the time people try to be in a dialogue. For instance, I think the most telling historical event was in 1968, after the Spring in Prague, and the fighting of the insurrection in Prague, when the Soviet Prime Minister hastened to Helsinki and explained to the Finnish Prime Minister that such a scenario would never be possible, for instance, in Helsinki.
I do very much believe that post-colonial and post-imperial understandings and treatments of Ukraine as well as Belarus and other post-Soviet countries are still very viable. And I want to use kind of what you started with, and that's Alexander Etkin's internal colonization, which treats the Russian Empire as a continuous land empire, which requires them to acquire the territory before they can internally colonize. And so all of these places that are falling within, including this attempt to reclaim this continuous land empire in a neo-imperial way, is them attempting to reassert colonial power. I think using that framework, this is still very valuable as an intellectual tool to treat this. The other thing that I really worry about with this kind of contact zone framework is that it too has fallen out of favor in Latin American scholarship. As you're probably aware, Latin American scholarship has returned to post-colonial and neo-imperial mindsets in the contemporary kind of framework as they're re-emerging in places like Guatemala and Mexico. So I'm wondering if maybe there might be some sort of more hybrid approach to this, using both what you're talking about, but also considering the unequal power relationships and very real territorial and attempts to internally and mentally colonize or maintain power. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yes, I think that's a very important point you raise, and I think it also has to do with the political implication, or the tacit political agendas behind analytic concepts. And of course, it is clear that in Southern America or in Latin America, the neo-imperial conceptualization of the situation is on vogue today, because it's directed against the US-American hegemon. And this, of course, is also the expression of the presence, I would say, of a political agenda. And I think in Ukraine, first after 1991, after independence, and now especially after 2014, the political agenda, of course, became very much important in the choice of your analytical toolbox. And I would say the post-colonial approach lends itself much more to political protest than these contact zone concept, which basically is a concept that basically is open to suggestions from all sides. And I think this is also why you again raised this issue of power asymmetry, which always is there. But I think, as I said, we should be aware of the dangers of victimization, which also is a trend which is not only present in Latin American studies or in Ukrainian studies, but it's all over the world. And I think the most interesting case in point is the German case. Because the Germans, they're not perpetrators in their own perception, at least since 2000. They now also raise topics like the raping of German women in Soviet-occupied Berlin, or ethnic cleansing, or the loss of territories, or another point is the destruction of German cities like Dresden at the very end, the very last month of the war, without military necessity. And so this, I think, model of self-victimization has become so prominent that I always like to put a question mark wherever I see it. Yeah.
Just a really quick response, and I promise I'll be quick. So I think that boiling down post-colonialism to this narrative of victimization might be a little bit of an overstatement, because there are real structural legacies of colonialism that create inequality, including economic and social and political inequalities. Like, they're there, you can't make the structures disappear. So you don't necessarily have to be in a victim mindset to kind of address something as post-colonial.
Yeah, that's right.
One could actually say, hey, we're in a post-colonial space, and we are going to reclaim our power, and we are going to try to figure out how to kind of correct these structural inequalities. So I would just kind of caution against that.
Yeah, maybe there are still two differences between colonial situations elsewhere and the colonial situation in the post-imperial or post-Soviet space. And I think one thing is race. It's difficult to say that there is a racial difference between Russians and Ukrainians. And the other is, of course, also this very fluent interrelation between the imperial and the colonial, if you remain within the discourse of post-colonialism. And I think there you really also run into very complex difficulties if you solely apply a post-colonial toolbox to the Russian-Ukrainian situation. But just to be sure, as I said in my talk, I do not propose to do away with the post-colonial concept, but I would like to put a question mark behind it and to complement it with these concepts from Latin American studies.
I like the model that you chose because Publishers article is actually published at the same time, also 1990s, and I think this model of concept zones brings exactly this sort of delimitation, because I mean publishing is, I mean he mentions also parody, I think. I mean he gives some examples.
Yes.
That, but
because he also talks about Rubahu and so on.
Yes. But what this model does, and this underlines also this fluidity. I mean, this limiting narrative and this self-victimization that you mentioned is also because publishing, what he does, I mean, he speaks about the Ukrainian literature not as an action or as a cultural production, but as a reaction. And this is what's, I mean, a successful way of looking at post-colonialism should be like, not in this typical way, I mean, of oppressed, of an answer to something that was imposed. And of course, I think this is mediation and bilingualism. I think this complements very illustratively what.
I think you raise a very important issues. I think many of those 9 concepts can also be used in the framework of a post-colonial discourse, and very fruitfully so. But what I would criticize in Pavlyushyn's approach is the fact that for him basically the post in postmodern, the post in post-colonial, and if you will, even the post in post-socialist, they're all the same posts. They're in a way temporal and Hegelian at the same time.
And they're anti-anti.
Yes, that's right. And so I think at the first glance he has a point, but on the other hand I think Ukrainian postmodernism in a way is also different from Western postmodernism. And Western postmodernism, of course, has this playful thing, but I think in the Ukrainian context, of course, there is also always, as I tried to highlight in my talk, there is this post-colonial pessimism. There is this post-colonial, post-modernist also resentment, which many authors now, of course, see confirmed by the recent political events, and this is also how they explain this in public.
It seems that the question of bilingualism is just the beginning of a story. I mean, it seems at first sight to be able to bracket a symmetry, but in a sense there is more to it. Why? Because you are never, as it were, within 2 languages. I mean, let's say individually, at an individual level, there is a medium of thoughts, of dreams, and so on, which is always one language. So I'm wondering what your thoughts about this are. And where are you exactly, you know, as a bilingual or multilingual person? especially given as appropriating a language already entails giving something of yourself, right? You're not going to have and develop the same thoughts in a foreign language as you would in your native one.
Well, I think the opposition between foreign and native language doesn't apply, for instance, in the case of Shevchenko. He was completely bilingual, and I think it's quite interesting that you point to this oversection between the imaginary dialogue and bilingualism. And here we are again with William Ockham and his razorblade, because these two theories have to do with one another, but they are not just complementary. And in the case of Shevchenko, I tried to argue that his bilingualism had nothing to do with the pragmatic use of his language. So, for instance, I don't think that we can say that he used Russian for official purposes and Ukrainian for his, poetry that was meant to build up a Ukrainian nation. I would say that there are two axes in a way. So there is a matrix, and one axis separates Russian and Ukrainian, and the other axis maybe distinguishes between two modes of expression, if I couldn't put it this way. And one mode of expression is paresia. And paresia means speaking up to the powerful. And here again we have this asymmetry. And paresia, of course, in Shevchenko's case, happens in his Ukrainian language poetry, very much so, which is very aggressive. And he was punished severely for that. But it happens also in his letters, and most notably in his diary. He never intended to publish his diary, although it was published shortly after his death. And paresia in Shevchenko happens both in the Russian language and the Ukrainian language key. And I think this is also one of these traps we should avoid, that we, if we see two dichotomies, we shouldn't hasten to identify them and to make them congruent, but we should see, well, how do they interrelate? And there I would really say that probably this imaginary dialogue, of course, has to do with bilingualism, but the imaginary dialogue in Shevchenko's dialogue with the empire does not coincide with his use of Ukrainian and Russian.
But it seems to me that it's not what's at stake really is, as long as we are talking about projections, the image of the other about myself and my image about the image of the other, what we are having here is just a vehicle with just communication in the very narrow sense of the term. Whereas dialogue involves, if we're talking about one person and the other person, involves precisely the breaking point of those images. I mean, it's not a constant projection of projections and so on. It's just that's not dialogue. And I'm thinking here of the debate between Levinas and Buber, because Levinas was always emphasizing the asymmetry of the relation, the dialogical relation. And Martin Buber, his master, was sort of optimistic about the possibility of a symmetric relation, which was precisely the relation of dialogue.
Yes, but I think here, of course, Levinas' own experience played an important role, because Levinas, after the Holocaust and after World War II, never ever set foot on German territory again. So basically, he was the one who really said there is an end to every dialogue. And in his view, of course, the German perpetrators had disqualified themselves forever for that dialogue. And in Levinas' case, I think he had also this quite interesting conception that dialogue is not something textual and not only discursive, but you need to see the other's face in order to have a real dialogue, which of course in terms of literature is not always possible. And I would say also here, if we apply imaginary dialogue as an analytical concept with these several stages of self-presentation, image and meta-image, you can also apply it in a situation which basically not always has to do with imperial and colonial cultures, but with cultures that may be very close or even identical. And the case in point here would be, for instance, Austria and Germany. And if you take a writer like Thomas Bernhard, who basically took issue with the Austrian image after World War II, and this Austrian image was that they were the first victim of the National Socialist aggression, which of course was historically untrue, but this was widely spread as both a self-presentation and an image. And Thomas Bernhard, himself being Austrian, basically heavily criticized this. And there you can also see how this cultural context of two cultures that are very close to each other but have decisively different political histories, cannot aptly be described in terms of post-colonialism, but rather in terms of these contact zones or imaginary dialogues, because Thomas Bernhard also wrote plays where these different voices are represented.
My first question is, how important is the previous period, Ukrainian Baroque literary tradition, for understanding this Russian-Ukrainian connection and correlation during the 19th century? Because as for me, what was important in the process of using of this term of contact zone, that is the idea that culture which is dominated also influences the other one, this hegemonic culture. And Ukrainian Baroque literary tradition was extremely important for 19th century, 20th century writers, and still now in 21st century writers in Ukrainian literature. I mean Grigory Skovoroda, first of all, and he was like number one and the crown for the whole project of Ukrainian literature, not only in 19th century. I would say that for Shevchenko, he's like, so Shevchenko in some sense is even fighting with Skovoroda for the displace of number one writers in the history of Ukrainian literature. But Ukrainian modernist project, such poets like Pavlo Tychina or Mykola Bazhan, they're based their new kind of poetry on Skovoroda poetics. I could also remember Trofan Prokopovich or Mitrofan Halevsky, the whole tradition of Kyiv Mohyla Academy and how it was incorporated into this imperial project. The second part of my question is about the 20th century, because maybe even easier is to apply this concept of contact zone the Ukrainian socialistic, realistic literature, yes, because it's like more closed situation. And the third part of my question is how the so-called Western Ukrainian literature is included into this 19th century Ukrainian national literature project. Yes, because we have such authors like, for example, Ivan Franko, Olga Kobylenska, Kobylenska starts to write in German. Franco also wrote in Polish and in German and published it in these languages. So they were influenced by this tradition, and that's not only about West Ukrainian literature, because this Kharkiv group of writers were also influenced directly by German tradition in 19th century. So what does it mean, how we could use this model of contact zone, also keeping in mind this different influences, traditions, different situation, this national literature as a result of this complicated influence?
Well, I would say, to start with the last part of the question, contact zone needs to be understood metaphorically. So these are not just two territories that have a common
That's
border,
more about tradition.
but for instance, I would say clearly the construction of a Ukrainian national literature followed Western European models. And for instance, look at the establishing of a German national literature which existed before a common national German state. The same holds true for Ukrainian literature. There is a short text by Kostomarov, which is a kind of an overview of texts written in Ukrainian, which is a history of Ukrainian literature avant la lettre, and histories of national literatures are part of the nation-building project. And there are other things that are part of this. I mentioned the national poet, for instance. The Baroque, I would say, this is also an argument against the application of post-colonialism to the Russian-Ukrainian situation, because during the Baroque period it was clear that Ukraine, or on what was later to become the Ukrainian territory, in Kiev, there was the cultural hegemony, and Russia basically was culturally less developed in the 17th century than the culture in Ukraine. So basically we have an inversion of cultural hegemony. And of course, all those literary texts made it eventually into the Russian cultural history, also because, of course, Russian intellectuals tried to usurpate and to appropriate these traditions, which in their view were basically Russian traditions. And Skovoroda, I think, is a different case, who does not belong to the established Baroque culture, because Skovoroda basically went underground. He was a bohemian, and he never really, well, his life was not about establishing a national cultural system. But nevertheless, of course, he had quite an impact.
Thank you very much, Uli, and thank you all for this intense discussion. And let's continue it over wine and pretzels as usual at the night. Thank you so much.